The night air is sharp and still, and there you are, walking beneath lantern-lit torii gates, the ancient forest silent around you, when a blade slips from shadow, a soft hiss of steel through silk, a flicker of moonlight on a razor's edge, and then silence again, a lone footstep, only the faintest gasp, and in that moment, centuries of myth and honor collapse into terror. This was tsujigiri, crossroads killing. A samurai, proud, defiant, testing a new sword on an unsuspecting pedestrian. Sharpened steel, raw adrenaline, and the body of an innocent became the unspoken proof of a warrior's prowess. The phrase literally means crossroads cutting, and during Japan's chaotic Sengoku age, around 1467 to 1600, such acts escalated from private duels to random, brutal street killings. Samurai, or sometimes violent gangs of kabukimono, lay waiting in dark intersections, slashing at peasants, merchants, and wanderers without provocation. A twisted form of curiosity became a form of terror. Tsujigiri morphed from sparring among knights to anonymous murder. Amazingly, this wasn't a hidden footnote, but a word solidified in the language because the phenomenon was disturbing enough to name. Despite the horror, it became part of Japan's lexicon and its conscience. The Tokugawa government, established as peace was restored, outlawed the practice in 1602, condemning tsujigiri as a capital crime. Offenders could be executed, paraded as warnings to others. But just because tsujigiri was banned doesn't mean it vanished. Even late into the Edo era, isolated incidents reeked of lawlessness and lethal eccentricity. There was the Yoshiwara massacre in 1696, when a disturbed nobleman massacred dozens of women in Edo's red light district in a psychotic rampage, evoking the spirit of tsujigiri's violence. He was executed, yet his act haunted public memory. And towards the end of Edo, tales persisted of gangs practicing tsujigiri beneath bridges. Martial artist Motoyoshi Kanaya once hid in ambush beneath Akabanabashi Bridge and killed a band of such rioters who had been terrorizing passers-by at night. Even as peace endured, brutality simmered. Historian Jordan Sand, heeding ethical clarity, reminds us that tsujigiri was never condoned. It wasn't a cultural norm, but a pathology. Even by samurai standards, those who committed these crimes were seen as deranged, not celebrated. The word exists not because society accepted it, but because it recoiled in horror. So why open with this chilling act? Tsujigiri isn't just shock for shock's sake. It sets a tone, a world where honor and savagery coexist, where codes bestowed power, and the power could kill. From this flash of midnight violence we begin to unravel layers, a rigid social order, lethal rights wielded as privilege, loyalty twisted into ritual suicide. These are not distant fantasies, they are the buried edges of feudal Japan. Stay with me, because tsujigiri is only the first cut into a deeper darkness. Imagine living in a world where your place at birth, completely beyond your control, decides whether you're a blade-wielding noble or someone whose only job is to endure. In feudal Japan, from the Sengoku chaos to the Tokugawa peace, society was sliced into rigid layers, each with its own rights, restrictions, and relentless boundaries. At the top sat the samurai. Though they made up maybe 5 to 10% of the population, they held all the power. Warriors to the bone, sworn to daimyo and shogun. Their swords were law, their swords were prestige, and even a bowed head formed their currency. During the Tokugawa era, refusal to bow wasn't just insolence, it could cost you your life. A farmer who failed to show the proper respect could be beheaded on the spot. Below them were the heartbeats of the nation, farmers. Contrary to other feudal systems, these men and women held grim respect because they fed a nation. Inspired by Confucian ideals, produce equaled value. Without their fields, no state could stand. Yet, the irony run deep. The farmers were honored in theory, but taxed to ruin in practice. Under Shogun Iemitsu, they were often forbidden from eating even a fraction of their own rice harvest, forced to hand it over, then pray for scraps in return. Next came the artisans, the craftspeople praised for their skill, yet penned into separate quarters. Woodcarvers, potters, swordsmiths, each created beauty born of patience, all while knowing they were one rung down in status. Even the finest samurai swordmaker, still just an artisan. After them came merchants, the lowest in the official hierarchy. Ironically, these were the people wielding wealth, often surpassing impoverished samurai, yet society viewed them as parasites. Profiting from others' labour, they were obstructed from mingling with higher classes, confined socially, their prosperity expected but socially condemned. But below them, truly at rock bottom, were the ite and hainin, people so stained by occupation or circumstance they were officially deemed unclean or even non-human. The hainin, beggars, street performers, executioners, lived as the non-persons. The eta, butchers, tanners, those handling death and decay, were branded extremely impure. These outcasts were forbidden from wearing proper clothing, barred from maps, excluded from human dignity. Even after the Meiji government abolished these classes in 1871, the stigma lived on. Survivors became known as burakumin, and many generations later still carried the burden of discrimination. The social fabric of Tokugawa Japan was stitched tightly to control. Mobility was rare, until the early 17th century, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi instituted policies that poured cement over opportunity, sealing everyone into hereditary status. Some people had the dangerous privilege of moving classes. By Edo's middle years, most were locked forever. But even at the edge of society, there were pockets of power. Burakumin leaders sometimes became rich. One Danzimon leader, an Eta chieftain, became indispensable to the shogunate by supplying leather materials, and even called lord in his own right. Yet society still spat on him for his origins. Hierarchy in feudal Japan wasn't just about privilege. It was a tool of fear, obedience, and identity. Each class confined, judging, enforcing. Samurai stood atop, watchers of everything. Farmers bowed beneath the weight of harvest and tax. Artisans crafted worth, disregarded in rank. Merchants thrived behind disdain, and outcasts were discarded from society's conscience. This was the system in which tsujigiri happened. A world where violence, injustice, and class could fuse into terrifying sword strokes at midnight. And yet, that was only the beginning. In our next section, we'll peel back more of this hardened order to reveal how justice became cruelty, and how privilege could snuff out life in the name of ritual. A silent apology, a whispered misstep. In feudal Japan, such small slights could become a matter of life and death, legally. This was the terrifying reality of kiri-sute gomen, a phrase meaning authorization to cut and leave the body. It was a samurai's legal right to draw his blade, strike down a commoner who had allegedly insulted him, and walk away without arrest. But though it sounds like carte blanche, it wasn't lawless. After the killing, the samurai had to provide a witness, report the incident, and spend 20 days under optional confinement to prove contrition. If the act was deemed unjust, the consequences were severe. Even death or forced seppuku, with his honor and legacy stripped entirely. Imagine casually bumping into a samurai on a narrow road, something minor, unintentional, but to a warrior trained to guard his honor, it could be catastrophe. One infamous story recounts how a samurai, Saiheiji Tomo of the Owari Tokugawa clan, ended up dishonored after a peasant snatched his wakizashi, short sword, and fled. In retaliation, Tomo didn't just kill the man, he exterminated the entire family. The act cost him his status, but even that redemption came at the price of unspeakable bloodshed. At a glance, kiri-sute gomen appears a balance of power and accountability, but in practice, it favored the blade hand. Many samurai would bribe local magistrates or come with prepared witnesses to justify their actions, particularly in Edo, the seat of the shogunate. Their prestige often shielded them from consequences, but slicing someone down was just one form of cruelty. Feudal Japan's justice system wielded far more brutal tools to control the masses. Edo's execution grounds, Kozukapura and Suzugamori, were notorious, estimated to have buried over 100,000 condemned souls. Criminal punishments were horrifyingly inventive. Boiling alive, crucifixion, sawing in half, being sliced at the waist, even more grotesque methods. Public parading before execution, or displaying the severed head to instill fear, these were not just punishments, they were deterrent theatre. One method, called Ikido, living torso, turned executions into ritual spectacle. Victims lay blindfolded, face down on a mound, then were beheaded and bisected in a single stroke. In horrifying detail, executioners sometimes etched the wound, or even recorded the kill onto their sword afterward. Torture, too, was a grim staple in the courts. Investigators tortured suspects with heavy ropes, stones, painful contortions, and suspension, with prisoners bound by arms and left hanging. Confessions, often coerced, were mandatory. No confession, no verdict. One scroll from Edo's courts shows a woman torn from her child with ropes, a bound samurai pinned by a dozen officers, and hair-raising scenes of trial and punishment. This wasn't fiction. It was daily cruelty. In villages, a crime might do more than condemn. Criminals were often banished through Shimanagashi, exiled to remote islands like Sado. Cut off from society, they became spirits cast into isolation, condemned not just by law but by the ripple of shame. These punishments, when viewed together, reveal a system designed not to deliver justice, but to enforce hierarchy with terror. The sword was law. Mercy was rare. Commoners faced more than guilt. They faced spectacle and erasure. Under such a system, a world emerges where sovereignty meant cleaving flesh, where torture extracted confessions, and where fear walked every street. Justice was both blade and brand, and those wielding power were often indistinguishably cruel. A heavy hush settles over a dying lord's chamber. Candles gutter, shadows shiver, and coppery grief mixes with fear. Then a blade is presented. The samurai grips it with trembling certainty and plunges it into his own belly. The blade slips free. He gasps. A second steps forward to strike the final blow. Death flows in ritual sacrifice, not defeat. This is seppuku, honor carved in agony. Seppuku, often casually called harakiri in the West, was no dramatic final act. It was a ritual of self-inflicted death, meant to restore lost honor, originating in the Heian period 793 to 1185. Seppuku allowed a warrior facing disgrace or capture to die with control, not at the mercy of enemies. The very act of disembowelment was a statement. Here, I accept death with courage. By the Edo period, seppuku was highly systemized, an intricately choreographed ritual. The samurai would don a white kimono, kneel before folded mats, and with a short sword carve into his abdomen. A trusted ally, the kaishakunin, awaited, ready to end the torment with a precise decapitation. It was not simply suicide. It was performance, catharsis, and cultural education in pain. But there was more. Motivations varied. Some were junshi, loyal subjects who followed their lord in death, not from punishment, but from devotion. Others chose kanshi, suicide to protest or atone for failure. Still others committed funshi, dying to avoid capture or dishonor. Take the Tokugawa shogunate. Even in peaceful Edo, when a lord died naturally, retainer loyalty could tip into tragedy. In 1651, when Shogun Iemitsu passed away, 13 of his closest advisors chose to kill themselves in junshi. It was a gesture of devotion, one that disrupted governance and forced the shogunate to act. Fearing instability, the Bakufu banned junshi in 1663. Violators risked far more than death. Their entire lineage and fief could be confiscated. Yet the law only bent, rarely broke. Instances of junshi persisted, often quietly. In 1607, following the death of a powerful figure, one of his vassals took his own life. Later, 26 retainers of the Lord Nabeshima Katsushige died after his passing. Each sacrifice legendarily polished the soul of honor, but hollowed out families and politics. Jump ahead centuries. The tradition bleeds into modernity with General Nogi Maresuke, a hero of the Russo-Japanese War. On the day of Emperor Meiji's funeral procession in 1912, Nogi and his wife performed junshi, ritual suicide in devotion, not the revenge of blood, but the surrender of life to loyalty. He left behind a complicated legacy, a modern general that chose ancient obedience. These were not spontaneous acts, but acts shaped by cultural expectation and ritual elegance. Still, they left behind grief, martyrdom, and national myth. Junshi was both devotion and tragedy. Seppuku was both redemption and suffering. Honor, when rigidly enforced, warped into coercion. Some samurai, the idealized heroes, were both architects and victims of this deadly system. To be in their world was to know that love for a lord could kill you just as readily as an enemy's blade. As chains of loyalty tightened, death became not a tragedy, but a statement. In life, your blade was your identity. In death, your blade, forged in ritual, made your memory endure.